On the surface, What Remains of Edith Finch is a game about a cursed family and a house full of death, strange accidents, tragic endings, a family tree that looks more like a graveyard. But once you actually step inside the Finch house, you realize something almost immediately. This isn't really a story about how people die. It's a story about how people live with loss, about how families explain pain to themselves, and about the stories we inherit long before we are old enough to question them. This game isn't asking you to break a curse or solve a mystery. It's asking something quieter and much harder. What happens when grief is never processed, only explained? What happens when pain turns into family mythology instead of being felt? And what changes when one person finally stops running from that history and decides to look at it honestly? Don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to my channel if you enjoy learning practical life lessons from video game stories. The Finch house looks wrong before you even enter it. Rooms are stacked on top of rooms, additions built without balance or symmetry, like the house kept growing in response to loss instead of time. It doesn't feel planned. It feels reactive, like grief made it taller. Edith returns here after years away. She's alone, she's pregnant, and she's carrying a journal meant for her child. From the beginning, it's clear this isn't a nostalgic visit. She's here because there are questions no one ever answered, and they didn't disappear when she left. Early on, Edith admits that her family never seemed strange to her growing up, and that much of what she's about to say might not make sense. That line matters. It tells us this story isn't about certainty, it's about confusion, about someone trying to understand a life that only becomes strange once you step far enough away from it. As she approaches the house, Edith explains that she was never allowed into many of the rooms. Some doors were off limits, others were nailed shut or blocked by furniture, as if the danger wasn't what was inside, but what entering might awaken. That's when the house stops being just a house. It becomes a map of a family's mind. Some memories are allowed, repeated, even celebrated. Others are buried, avoided, or turned into warnings. Not because anyone is cruel, but because no one ever learned how to sit with the pain those memories contain. Inside the Finch family, all of this suffering is explained by one idea: the curse. A belief that being a Finch makes tragedy inevitable. It's spoken with fear, but also carried with a strange sense of pride. Because if everything is fate, then no one has to look too closely at why the same pain keeps repeating. But the deeper Edith goes, the clearer it becomes that nothing supernatural is required to explain what happened here. What looks like a curse is something far more familiar. Trauma that was never healed, grief that was never spoken, fear passed quietly from one generation to the next. And that's why this game stays with people. Because most families don't talk about curses, they talk about patterns, about how people like us end up, about what's normal, what's expected, and what's hopeless. Edith's journey through the house is really an invitation to look at the stories you were given about your families, your past, and yourself, and ask a dangerous question: are these truths, or are they explanations someone needed in order to survive? Inside the Finch house, every family member who died has a bedroom preserved exactly as it was. After each death, the door is sealed. Nothing is moved. Nothing is changed. The room becomes a shrine, a final sentence written in furniture and dust. Edith's great-grandmother, Eddie, lives surrounded by these rooms. She tells the stories of each death over and over again, turning them into legends. Meanwhile, Edith's mother, Dawn, reacts in the opposite way. She boards up rooms, removes photos, and refuses to talk about the past at all. Psychologically, these are two very common responses to trauma. One clings to memory, retelling it until it feels controlled and meaningful. The other avoids it completely, believing silence is the only form of safety. At one point, Edith says,
"I think we've been surrounded by death for so long, we've just gotten used to it."
When a story is repeated often enough, it stops sounding like interpretation and starts sounding like fact. The curse removes responsibility. If tragedy is inevitable, then no one has to ask hard questions about patterns, choices, or emotional damage. No one has to ask whether something could have been different. In real families, the curse rarely sounds dramatic. It sounds like offhand comments and limiting beliefs repeated so often, they become our identity. We can't afford it. Don't waste money, it's hard to come by. When you have a stable job, you should be satisfied and don't ever leave. These stories shape behavior. They quietly limit what people believe is possible for them. Edith's journey matters because she refuses both extremes. She doesn't romanticize the deaths, and she doesn't pretend they didn't happen. She walks through each story and asks a simple but powerful question. Is this destiny, or is this unhealed pain mistaken for fate? Don't forget you are also the author of your own story. But before we are able to change anything, we must be aware of our current limits and fearful patterns that stop us from moving to the next level. That's why you must heal your past wounds, which most likely came from your childhood, long before your conscious understanding. Ask yourself, what's the lesson to be learned? Then let them go, as they no longer serve where you want to go. The stories inside the Finch house don't just describe death. They describe unmet needs. Needs that were misunderstood, ignored, or never given language. And when needs go unnamed, they don't disappear. They come back sideways, exaggerated, and sometimes frightening. Molly's story begins with something small. She was sent to bed without dinner. She was hungry. That hunger becomes imagination, and imagination becomes a strange, escalating fantasy where she transforms again and again, consuming everything in her path. Molly White.
I woke up and I was starving, so I looked around for something to eat.
This line appears at the beginning of Molly's journal entry. This isn't just about food. It's about a child whose needs aren't being understood. Hunger becomes a symbol for desire without guidance. As the story continues, Molly's appetite grows more extreme, more monstrous, until she calmly concludes,
But it's not going to wait much longer. It needs to feed, and we both know I will be delicious.
This final line closes her story, and is unsettling because it captures what happens when a need is never acknowledged. Hunger consumes her entirely, and she becomes the victim of her own appetite. Barbara's story explores a different kind of hunger, not for food, but for recognition, told as a horror comic. Her story exaggerates the fear of being forgotten until it becomes literal monsters at the door. The narration tells us Barbara's identity is built entirely around being seen. Later, the story reveals its core fear with the line,
Edie told me all Barbara wanted was to be remembered, as absurd as that comic was. Maybe what Edie saw was a happy ending.
That line hits because it's honest. Without applause, without attention, she feels erased. Walter's story strips things down even further. After Barbara's death, he retreats into a bunker beneath the house, convinced the outside world is too dangerous to face. He survives for decades, but he doesn't live. Walter White.
Maybe this is all a mistake. But I need to stop living the same day, even if it kills me.
That line captures the cost of avoidance perfectly. Safety without risk slowly becomes its own kind of death. Somehow, we are not so different to Walter. Most people work in a job they hate for decades just for the paycheck. It's like repeating the same day over and over again at the cost of life experiences. Together, these stories show three common coping strategies: escaping into appetite and fantasy, building identity entirely around approval, withdrawing completely to avoid pain. None of these begin as mistakes. They begin as attempts to survive on a false purpose. They become destructive only when they turn into the only way a person knows how to live. Lewis's story is one of the most powerful depictions of inner escape in any game. On one side of the screen, he's standing at a cannery, chopping fish heads all day in a repetitive, mind-numbing job. On the other side, inside his mind, a fantasy world slowly comes to life. At first, it's just a simple maze. Then it becomes a kingdom. Then it becomes everything. His psychiatrist White.
Newly sober, I believe Lewis first noticed the monotony of his daily life. He kept working at the cannery, but he withdrew part of himself. In our sessions, I saw the same behavior. His mind began to wander.
This line appears in the letter you hear during his sequence. and it explains his struggle in simple terms. Lewis isn't lazy, he isn't weak, he's trying to survive a reality that feels empty by building a virtual one in his head. As the level goes on, the fantasy world grows bigger and more detailed, while the real world shrinks to a corner of the screen. At some point, you realize you're barely paying attention to the fish anymore. You're doing exactly what Lewis is doing, choosing the inner world over the outer one. This letter lands because it describes something many adults quietly experience. When life feels dull, painful, or pointless, it becomes easier and easier to drift into daydreams, into screens, into plans about a future self that never quite arrives. By the end, Lewis's fantasy self becomes a king. He's adored, respected, and central to everything. The real Lewis, standing at the conveyor belt, feels like a background character. When he finally walks up toward the guillotine in both worlds, it isn't just a shocking moment, it's a symbol. He isn't just ending his life, he's choosing the fantasy over the body that's been carrying him. Many adults do a softer version of what Lewis does, maybe not with a literal kingdom, but with constant daydreaming, endless planning, fantasizing about a better version of themselves, or living almost entirely online. The problem isn't that these inner worlds exist. The problem is when they become more real, more important, and more loved than the life right in front of you. The lesson here isn't stop imagining, it's build a bridge. Let your inner world inform how you live, instead of replacing how you live. If your inner self is brave, creative, kind, or powerful, ask, what is one small way I can practice that today, in this reality? Lewis never gets that chance, you still do. Lewis's story is a reminder that when your outer life feels unbearable, you need support, not escape alone. Talking to someone, getting help, making even small changes, these steps might not feel as dramatic as a fantasy kingdom, but they're the ones that keep you here long enough to build a life that you don't need to constantly run away from. One of the most important things Edith Finch shows is that your life didn't start with you. It started long before you were born, in the stories, fears, and beliefs of the people who came before you. Parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, people you might never meet, but whose choices still shape your inner world. In Eddie's room, you can look through a slide viewer that tells the story of Alden Finch, the first Finch on the island. The narration says,
500 years, the Finches have been famous throughout Norway for their fortune and misfortune.
That line appears in the old slideshow Eddie keeps, and it shows how deeply this cursed story has sunk in. It isn't just a bad run of luck, it's part of their identity. Odin loads his house onto a boat to escape the curse, the slides tell us.
On January 7th, 1937, he set sail with his family and his house, hoping to leave the curse behind.
But the house sinks to the bottom of the sea, and Odin dies before he even reaches land. The story could have become a warning about trying to run from problems without understanding them. Instead, it becomes proof of the curse. Eddie herself becomes the keeper of these stories. Her room is full of newspaper, articles, paintings, and little shrines. She refuses to evacuate during a forest fire and ends up in the paper as Eddie won't go. To her, the past is always alive. She says about the old house in the water, I dream about it every night. Dawn, Edith's mother, sees all this and reacts the opposite way. Where Eddie remembers, Dawn removes. Where Eddie keeps door open in her mind, Dawn seals real doors in the house. One generation is trying to protect through forgetting. The other is trying to protect through remembering. Edith stands in the middle. She sees Eddie's love of stories and Dawn's fear of them. She says later, while looking at the family graves,
Edie's side was always easier for me to understand. But the older I get, the more I can see where my mom was coming from.
This is a key moment. Edith isn't choosing sides. She's beginning to understand that both women are reacting to pain they didn't know how to heal. In real life, this is where understanding your family and especially your grandparents can change everything. The rules you grew up with about work, money, emotion, trust, love didn't appear out of nowhere. They were shaped by what your parents and grandparents went through, their wars, their losses, their fears. Maybe a grandparent lived through poverty, so they told your parents, you can't trust anyone. You have to work twice as hard as everyone else. Maybe a parent grew up in a home where emotions were dangerous, so they told you, we don't talk about this. Those statements might feel harsh, but they often started as survival strategies. Edith's decision to come back to the house is a decision to stop guessing and start understanding. She wants to know not just what happened, but why. She wants to see her family as people, not just as stories. You can do something similar in your own life. Ask older relatives about their past, not just the good parts, but the hard ones. These are examples of repeated phrases in my family. We are not the rich. In this family, tolerance is virtue. Always be humble. You have it easy. We have overcome a much harder life. Notice how those lines line up with your own fears and scarcity mindset. You don't have to agree with everything you learn. You don't have to keep every belief. But understanding where it came from gives you a choice. You can say, this helped my family survive then, but it's hurting me now. Or this belief kept them safe in their world, but I choose to be bold, to take action and blaze my own path. Edith shows that you don't honor your family by repeating their pain. You honor them by understanding it, learning from it, and then choosing a healthier way forward. As Edith climbs higher into the house and deeper into the stories, the weight of everything she's uncovering becomes heavier. She's not just reading about distant relatives. She's reading about her own brothers, her own mother, the people she loved and lost. And she's doing all of this while being pregnant, knowing that whatever she understands or doesn't will be passed on to her child. At one point, walking through the cemetery, she admits,
Maybe we believed so much in a family curse, we made it real.
This line appears as she looks at the graves, and is one of the most important in the game. It suggests the idea that belief isn't neutral. If you are told all your life that nothing will end well, you might stop trying. If you are told that love always leads to loss, you might stop letting people in. A curse can quietly become a script. Later, she says to her future child in the journal,
I want you to be amazed that any of us ever had a chance to be here at all.
This line comes near the end, and it marks a shift. Edith isn't denying what happened. She isn't pretending the deaths weren't tragic or unfair, but she's choosing a new focus. Instead of staring only at how things ended, she wants her child to look at the fact that they existed at all. What Edith does, in simple terms, is this. She goes back, she looks honestly, she feels the grief, she refuses to turn it into either superstition or silence, and then she passes the truth on with as much tenderness as she can. She can't protect her child from everything that hurt her, but she can give them context, she can give them words, she can give them a story that doesn't end in we are cursed, but instead says we were fragile, we were scared, we made mistakes, and we still loved, hoped, and tried. In real life, that's one of the most healing things you can do with your own pain and your own family history. Not erase it, not dramatize it, but tell it honestly in a way that gives the next part of your life or the next generation more choice than you had. When you do that, you're doing what Edith does. You're turning inherited fear into shared understanding. You're taking something that felt like fate and turning it back into what it always was. Human behavior, human reaction, human attempts to cope. The game ends not with the curse broken, but with the story reframed. The Finch family is still full of graves, the house is still strange, the past is still heavy, but the way it's carried has changed. The last voice you hear is not Olden, Eddie, or Dawn. It's Edith's child, reading her words, shaped by everything she went through and everything she chose to pass on. They say in the final moments. That line is the heart of it. None of us knows exactly how our story ends. We can't control everything that happens to us, but we can choose how we understand it. Like Edith, you can choose what kind of story you write next. Thank you for watching.